Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
Heath masterminded the robbery that killed 4 people in Bisbee, but he only got life in prison. The town wouldn't accept it, dragged him out of jail and strung him up from a pole. The coroner, cynical, wrote down death by emphysema, aggravated by strangulation. Before Oklahoma became a state, the indigenous nations of the territory had their own laws and courts. Anyone who crossed the line answered for it right there, and that held even for white outsiders. Old West justice didn't always look the way the movies show it. Crime in Indian Territory landed in the federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas. The man in charge there was Judge Isaac Parker, the so-called hanging judge, who sentenced more than 160 people to death. A good share of those who climbed the gallows were indigenous. The man who carried out Fort Smith's sentences was George Malladin, a slight fellow who treated the gallows like a trade. He hanged dozens of men and tended his own knots and ropes. He called it clean work. The condemned disagreed. Sontag and Evans robbed trains belonging to a railroad the whole valley hated, so they nearly became heroes. The law chased the pair for 10 months. Cornered in a haystack and shot, Sontag died soon after. On his headstone, they carved a locomotive. Ned Christie was a Cherokee leader accused of killing a deputy, a crime he always denied. For years, he resisted capture in a fortified cabin in the mountains. The manhunt became a war against a single man. The law brought armed men, explosives, and even a cannon. Decades later, the charge against him came to be seen as a great injustice. The scalp became a symbol of indigenous savagery, but the truth is dirtier. Colonial and territorial governments paid a bounty for every Indian scalp turned in. Taking scalps was also official white policy. At the start of the 18th century, somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison roamed the continent. In this 1892 photo at a factory near Detroit, the skulls were turned into fertilizer and glue. When it was taken, only 456 wild bison remained free. On the frontier, the line between lawman and outlaw was thin. Many a sheriff had once been an outlaw, and many an outlaw had once worn a badge. Who counted as the right side in the end was whoever was left standing after the gunfight. In most settlements, there was no judge, jail, or deputy anywhere nearby. Order came out of a gun barrel and from the hands of whoever was willing to pull the trigger first. Justice, out there, was a matter of aim and nerve. Doc Holliday and the Earp brothers became symbols of the Old West after the shootout in Tombstone. But, unlike the legend, almost everything around them was inflated by the movies, the books, and the retellings. To this day, images attributed to Doc Holliday have to be viewed with caution, because truly confirmed photos of him are extremely rare. After several robberies, Butch Cassidy's gang slipped up out of vanity. They posed, well-dressed, in a Fort Worth studio. The photographer displayed the portrait in his window. A detective recognized the faces, and the handsome photo turned into a wanted poster. In 1901, in New Mexico, the rope used to hang the train robber was far too long. Ketchum climbed up steady and told them to dig his grave deep. When he dropped through the trap door, he was decapitated instantly. They sewed the head back on before burial. The Rangers came from a time when Texas wasn't even a state yet, created to patrol the frontier on horseback. They became one of the oldest police forces in the United States. Their reputation was summed up in a single phrase: one riot, one Ranger. Belle Starr rode in a velvet dress with a revolver on her hip, hiding horse thieves and outlaws. In 1889, she was killed by a shot in the back near her home, 2 days before her birthday. No one was ever convicted of the crime. Washakie led the Shoshone for decades and bet on alliance with the whites instead of war. A fort was named after him while he was still alive. When he died, near 100 years old, he was buried with full military honors, something rare for an indigenous chief. The Lakota ruled the Great Plains on horseback and depended on the bison for everything, from food to shelter. Wiping out the herds was also a way to break this people. Without the bison, the resistance was living on borrowed time. While the ordinary woman was pushed into the kitchen, some became sharpshooting stars in stage shows. They hit coins in the air and cigarettes in the mouths of assistants. In the ring, their aim was worth more than any sermon about a woman's place. The saloon was church, bank, courthouse, and post office all at once. Many settlements had more bars than decent houses. It was there that deals were closed, fortunes were gambled, and often where it was decided who would walk out alive. Pushed onto reservations, peoples who lived by hunting came to depend on government rations that arrived rotten or never arrived at all. They traded the freedom of the plains for a fence and a promise that was almost never kept. Every treaty signed between the government and the indigenous peoples cost land, hunting grounds, and freedom. The promises lasted only until gold or a railroad turned up in the way. Most of those agreements were torn up before the ink even dried. Martha Jane Canary drank, cursed, and shot like any man on the frontier, and told stories about herself that no one could confirm. She became a character while still alive. Separating what she did from what she invented is an impossible task even today. San Carlos, in Arizona, was the Apache reservation nicknamed Hell's 40 Acres. Heat, hunger, and disease were part of the package. Crossing that river meant arriving at a place built to break the very people who once owned the desert. Helena was born from a gold strike at a place named Last Chance Gulch. 4 down-on-their-luck miners tried one last spot and hit it. The settlement became one of the cities with the most millionaires per capita in the country. The gold rush promised riches, but delivered exhaustion. Many miners spent their days covered in dust, mud, and sweat, working for little and risking everything. Cave-ins, disease, and accidents were part of the routine. The gold rose to the surface, but many men stayed buried in the promise. The golden age of the cowboy lasted only a short while, about 20 years. Barbed wire and the railroad killed the great cattle drives. By the time this photo was taken, the free trade was already becoming a memory and a costume for shows. A cowboy's day was dust, saddle, and cattle from dark to dark. The romantic life of the movies didn't exist. The pay was low, the food was beans, and the company most nights was his own horse. Annie Oakley could hit a playing card edge on and snuff out the glowing tip of a cigarette in her husband's mouth. On one tour, she shot the cigarette held by the future Kaiser Wilhelm at his own request. Years later, she joked that she could have changed history with that shot. The journey west took months in a slow wagon pulled by oxen. More people died of disease and accidents than of attacks. Every makeshift camp on the prairie was a gamble against hunger, cold, and distance. Calamity Jane asked to be buried next to Wild Bill Hickok, the man she claimed to have loved. Her friends obliged. They say some of them did it as a joke, knowing Hickok could barely stand her in life. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres free to anyone who could hold out 5 years on the land. Many families gave up everything for that promise. What they found was drought, locusts, and winter, and a good number quit before the term was up. Before barbed wire, cattle ran loose, and the ranch was almost a fort isolated in the middle of nowhere. The house, the corral, and the well were everything. The nearest neighbor could be a full day's ride away. Zapata fought for a simple idea: land and freedom for those who worked it. He became a symbol for the peasants of southern Mexico. In 1919, he was lured into an ambush by an officer who pretended to want to switch sides and died riddled with bullets. To pull out gold, miners turned jets of water against entire mountains and washed them away. The technique filled the rivers with mud and destroyed farming downstream. California ended up banning the method in 1884. In 1916, Villa crossed the border and attacked a town in New Mexico, the only land invasion of the United States in more than a century. The American army sent thousands of men after him and came back empty-handed. He was killed in 1923. On the frontier, it wasn't always the gunslinger who got rich. Often it was the merchant selling food, tools, ammunition, and credit to settlers, miners, and travelers. Wherever a counter went up, a town soon followed. The Old West was also built by those who sold, not only by those who shot. In schools inside the reservations, indigenous children were trained to become farmers in the white mold. Learning to brand cattle was part of a larger plan, to erase the old culture and force a new one into shape. Gardner, in Montana, was the gateway to Yellowstone, the first national park in the world, created in 1872. The train poured out tourists, where before there had been only geysers and bison. Untouched nature became a travel destination. A mediocre actress, Pauline became one of the Union's best spies, hiding plans in her shoe. Caught, she was sentenced to hang and saved days before by the arrival of the troops. She earned an honorary rank of major and died poor, of an overdose, forgotten. Curtis spent 30 years and 40,000 photographs documenting the indigenous peoples before they vanished, bankrolled by a banker. This image of tiny riders beneath an immense cliff wall became one of the most famous portraits of that world. Libby was widowed at 34 when her husband was killed at Little Bighorn. She spent the next 57 years defending his image, writing books and silencing critics. She outlived almost all of her husband's enemies and shaped the legend exactly as she wanted. Around 12,000 Chinese laid track across the Sierra Nevada, boring through rock for a wage lower than the whites. Many died in avalanches and explosions. Once the railroad was finished, the country responded with a law to bar their immigration. For more than a century, only one authenticated photo of Billy the Kid existed. That small portrait on metal went to auction in 2011 and sold for $2-3 million. Every new image that turns up claiming to be him falls under immediate suspicion. In 1874, Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills and announced gold in the sacred hills of the Lakota. The rush that followed tore up the treaty that protected that land. 2 years later, he would die at Little Bighorn. By the end of the 1880s, the wild Texas was already showing signs of its end. The railroad was arriving, barbed wire was cutting through the open range, and the long cattle drives were dying out. The era of the free cowboy was closing right in front of those who had lived it. On the frontier, whoever owned a store often earned more than any gunslinger. He sold tools, food, and credit to miners and settlers. A town that prospered almost always began with a counter, not with a gunfight. With no trees on the prairie, the pioneer built his house with bricks of earth and root cut from the very ground. The soddies were warm in winter and cool in summer, but they dripped mud in the rain and shared the roof with snakes and insects. Far from any doctor, the frontiersman depended on his own aim to eat and his own luck to stay alive. He hunted, tanned the hide, and bled in silence. Surviving out there was a full-time trade. Annie Oakley shot at an apple balanced on the head of her own dog, Dave, who stayed still, trusting. The act terrified the audience and never failed. She only had to miss by an inch to lose her best friend in the ring. The hunter Seth Kinman made chairs from the animals he killed and gave them as gifts to presidents. This one, made of grizzly bear hide, ended up with President Andrew Johnson. Before that, he had already given Lincoln a chair made of elk antlers. In Laramie, the Moyer brothers turned power into business. With Big Steve Long wearing the deputy's badge, they spread fear, collected debts, and got rid of anyone in the way. The law, in their hands, became a threat. Only when the town fought back did that grip begin to crumble. Even on the dusty frontier, science found a way to arrive. Astronomers set up telescopes on ranches to observe the clear skies of the west. While some pointed revolvers, others pointed lenses at the stars. The wagon train moved forward in single file, sometimes forming a circle at night to protect the cattle and the people. The journey lasted months. Whoever set out west knew they might never again see those left behind. Fowler was rich, a bully, and killed for nothing. When his lawyers delayed the hanging, Socorro lost its patience. With the rope around his neck, he cried out to the angels. A vigilante answered, "Cold night for an angel, Joe." The railroad decided the fate of towns. The one that got track grew. The one left out died. The Boise Depot, built in 1893, was an entire town's bet on not being forgotten on the map. Deadwood was born from a gold rush on Indian land with no law and no government. It was there that Wild Bill Hickok took a bullet to the back of the head in 1876, holding aces and eights, the hand still called the dead man's hand. The war between settlers and the Dakota people in Minnesota ended in tragedy. In the end, 38 Dakota men were hanged all at once in the largest mass execution in United States history, with the signature of President Lincoln himself. A new town in the West always had a makeshift hotel of board and dust to take in those who came looking for work. The nightly rate was steep and the walls were thin. It was there that the stranger decided whether to stay or move on. Here, Calamity Jane shares a drink with the cowboy Teddy Blue Abbott. The two were part of the same world of cattle, liquor, and trail. Abbott left one of the most honest accounts of cowboy life, without the gloss of the legends. Still a boy, in 1864, Robert McGee was scalped in an attack and left for dead. He survived, his head marked for the rest of his life. He went on to exhibit himself showing the scar, living proof of a violence that few lived to tell about. It was in this isolated stone house that Pat Garrett surrounded and captured Billy the Kid in the winter of 1880. One of the kid's companions was killed coming out. Garrett waited in the snow. The most wanted outlaw in the territory fell without firing a shot. Building the railroad in the Nevada desert meant camping in the middle of nothing, with no water or shade. The workers pushed forward rail by rail under heat and dust. The train that would cut across the continent was raised with shovel, pick, and sweat. Watkins was one of the country's greatest landscape photographers, and his images of Yosemite helped turn it into a protected area. His fate was cruel. He went blind and lost almost his entire collection in the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. This is the last known image of Buffalo Bill Cody, taken in January 1917. Days later he died in Denver, broke. The man who sold the myth of the Old West to the whole world ended up without the money from his own show. Pecos was so rough that the fame of the rodeo came out of it. In the saloon, cowboys settled their quarrels with bullets and drank until sunrise. The town entered legend as one of the places where life was worth less than a round of whiskey. The chuck wagon was invented by a Texas rancher to feed the men on the long cattle drives. It became the center of the camp and the heart of the crew. Wherever the chuck wagon stopped, the whole outfit stopped to eat. For 10 days in February 1913, the Mexican capital turned into a battlefield. The coup brought down President Madero, who ended up imprisoned and murdered. Those 10 days of blood changed the course of the revolution. In the saloon, the poker table was where fortunes changed hands in a single night. An accusation of cheating often ended in gunfire. Sitting down to play with armed strangers took as much courage as luck. In a prosperous mining town, the saloon went all out. Imported mirror, fine wood bar, and chandelier. It was the luxury possible at the end of the world. While the silver vein lasted, people drank as if the party would never end. Every mile of track in the Arizona desert was wrenched from the rock under furnace heat. The railroad linked isolated mines to the rest of the country. Where the train passed, a town was born. Where it didn't, only dust was left. The photo of the family, posing proudly in front of the wagon, hides the harshness of the routine. Drought, isolation, and brutal winter were everyday life in Nebraska. Plenty of people posed like this and gave up the land before the year was out. In the dry West, water was liquid gold. Where there was no well or river, it arrived in barrels pulled by wagon, brought from far away. Running out of water wasn't a discomfort, it was a matter of life or death for the whole town. This is Custer's march toward the Black Hills, the spark for everything. The discovery of gold in the sacred land of the Lakota brought invaders and broke the treaty. The path that opened there led straight to Little Bighorn. Jackson photographed the West like no one else, and his images of the Yellowstone region helped convince Congress to create the first national park in the world. His camera turned landscape into a protection law. The dirt street with 2 saloons was the whole town. Hazen was born from the railroad and lived off the travelers who stopped there. A town like that grew fast with the train and could become a ghost just as quickly. The Colt changed the frontier. For the first time, a man could fire several times without reloading. In the hands of the Rangers, it became a tool of patrol and of power. The 6-shooter settled many a dispute before it reached a courtroom. Tombstone was born from a silver mine and grew too fast. It was rich, violent, and full of armed men. It earned the nickname of the town, Too Tough to Die, and it nearly did die when the silver ran out. The stagecoach crossed chasms on log bridges that looked unable to hold the weight. Tipping over into a ravine was a real risk. The passenger paid dearly to be jostled for days in a wooden box on wheels. For generations, the Umatilla fished for salmon on the Columbia River, pushed onto reservations. They watched the land shrink and the fish vanish with the dams that would come later. The photo shows a way of life already hemmed in on all sides. In the Klondike Rush, the mounted police required every prospector to bring nearly a ton of supplies so as not to starve in winter. Many climbed the icy mountain dozens of times, carrying their own survival on their backs. The face of Irontail, a Lakota chief and star of Buffalo Bill's show, helped shape the 5-cent coin. On the other side, a bison, the 2 symbols of the West, engraved in metal just as they were nearly being wiped out. In Alaska, the gold fever dragged men into the cold, the mud, and the isolation. Many arrived dreaming of quick fortune, but found hard labor, crude tools, and a brutal life. For every man who struck gold, many others came back with nothing, beaten by the ice and the distance. Before becoming the country's most famous outlaw, Jesse James was a teenage Confederate guerrilla in a band that massacred civilians. Years later, he died at home with a bullet in the back, fired by an ally, while straightening a picture on the wall. The photo of the family gathered in front of the earthen house is also a portrait of stubbornness. Building with sod meant admitting there was no wood and no ease there. Every wall of clay was a bet that it would be worth staying. In 1876, Deadwood teemed with prospectors, gamblers, and outlaws. With no real legal authority at all, the town existed illegally on Indian land. It was the kind of place where fortune and death arrived in the same week. Flagstaff grew up beside the railroad in the timber of the surrounding forests. The name came from a makeshift mast on a pine tree used to raise the flag. A frontier town was born like that, from a practical gesture that turned into history. John Grabble documented the Dakota West like few others. The largest collection of his photos is kept in the Library of Congress. Without that camera, much of what we know about the end of the cattle drives would have become only a memory passed from mouth to mouth. This image came from the hands of a white farmer who devoted his life to documenting the history of the Yakama and the Nez Perce from their point of view. While many only wanted the Indian land, he wanted to preserve the memory that was being erased. Dodge City was the queen of the cattle towns, the end of the line for the drives and a gathering point for armed and drunken cowboys. It even had an informal cemetery, Boot Hill, for those who died with their boots on, with no time to take them off. Soapy Smith became the boss of Skagway during the gold rush, running cons and rigged games. In 1898, in a showdown on the wharf, He and an opponent shot each other dead almost at the same instant. The empire of fraud lasted only a few months. The shootout that became famous as the one at the OK Corral lasted about 30 seconds and left 3 dead. Half a dozen seconds were enough to create the most told scene of the Old West. The photo shows the place already in ruins after a fire. Virginia City sprang up over the Comstock Lode, one of the largest silver veins in history. Wells Fargo guarded and transported that wealth. Where there was precious metal, there was a safe, an armed escort, and people willing to steal it all. The 3 stars of the West took the stage together in a theatrical play about their own adventures. Wild Bill Hickok hated acting, flubbed his lines on purpose, and quit the tour. Killing for real, he knew how to do. Pretending in front of an audience, he couldn't stand. Buffalo Bill hired real indigenous people to reenact battles in the show. For many of them, it was the only way to make a living and travel while their homeland vanished. They acted out their own defeat, night after night, for money. Pawnee Bill put together a show to rival Buffalo Bill's. In the end, the 2 joined forces in the so-called Two Bill Show. It was circus, propaganda, and myth sold as history, in a West that was already more on the stage than in real life. Ike Clanton spent the night before the OK Corral shootout, taunting the Earps and Doc Holliday. When the fight broke out, he was unarmed and ran off. He survived that day, but was shot dead in 1887 trying to escape a lawman. In a town full of armed men, Samantha Fallon ran a hotel and a hat shop in Tombstone. A woman owning her own business was the exception. While they fought for fame in the gunfight, she built a fortune behind the counter. The Concord was the finest stagecoach of its day, built by hand and expensive as a luxury car. Instead of stiff springs, it swayed on leather straps, which made for less jolting. Even so, days of travel inside it broke any passenger. The Gem Theater was theater, bar, and brothel all at once, run by a man who treated the workers as merchandise. Behind the stage lights, it hid one of the most sordid houses in Deadwood. At each leg, the stagecoach stopped at an isolated station to swap out the tired horses. The passenger ate poorly, slept little, and pressed on. Those board shacks in the middle of nowhere were the only resting points on the road. At the turn of the century, posing for the photographer was a luxury and a ceremony. Many people had a single portrait made in their entire lives. For most of these men, that stiff, solemn photo was the only way not to disappear from memory completely. The photo marks the train crossing a temporary bridge over the Kansas River, pushing west. Each of those temporary bridges was the railroad gaining ground. Where the track arrived, the old world of the horse began to die. At 10 years old, Lehman was taken by Apaches in Texas and raised as a warrior. He spent 9 years fighting settlers and soldiers. Forced to return to his German family, he had already forgotten his own language and came back a stranger inside his own home. The title of the photo, "We Have the Wealth," was pure propaganda to draw people into the Dakota Gold Rush. For every miner who struck it rich, dozens came back broke or didn't come back at all. The photo sold a dream that few realized. The blacksmith was a key piece of the mine. He sharpened drills, repaired tools, and kept everything running down in the depths. Without him, the pick stopped. The gold came out of the rock, but it depended on the anvil and hammer of a single man. After 20 years in the underworld, 12 as a brothel madam, Josie Washburn left it all behind and wrote a book exposing the system. She pointed the finger at property owners, police, and politicians who profited from the misery. Respectability was laid bare. Before the cinema, home entertainment was the stereoscope, which gave photos the illusion of depth. Photographers staged romantic and comic scenes, like this mischievous kiss, just to amuse the family in the parlor. It was the domestic entertainment of the age. In 1899, the Wild Bunch attacked a Union Pacific train near Wilcox, Wyoming. They blew up the express car and fled with the money, leaving behind a scene of destruction. The robbery became one of the most famous heists of Butch Cassidy and his men. Long before the casinos, Las Vegas was a railroad settlement in the desert. The Arizona Club was one of the town's first spots for gambling and drinking. The mecca of betting started small, in a frontier bar no one imagined would lead where it did. After weeks eating dust on a cattle drive, a bath in a creek was the cowboys' only luxury. Life on the open range had no comfort at all. A dip in the cold water was worth more than any saloon at that moment. In the Mexican Revolution, whoever controlled the railroad controlled the war. Entire armies traveled by train, with troops, horses, and cannon. The Zapatistas posing atop the locomotive show, who was in charge on that stretch of track. Helena was born of gold and for a time had more millionaires per capita than almost anywhere in the country. The main street rose right over a mining ravine. Beneath the pavement, the vein that created the town still ran. This photo brings together legends like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, called in to settle a power dispute in Dodge City. The curious thing, The so-called Dodge City War ended without a single shot. The menacing pose was enough to end the quarrel. Valuable cargo crossing the mountain called for armed men on guard at every bend. Gold and silver drew robbers like flies. In those narrow passes, a well-set ambush could net the fortune of an entire mine. In South Texas, near the border, the Rangers lived by patrol, pursuit, and gunfight. The work was lonely and violent. They posed serious, gun on the hip, because serious was the only way to face that kind of routine. To haul borax out of Death Valley, a line of 20 animals was hitched up to pull giant wagons more than 100 miles across the desert. The route crossed the hottest place on the continent. The wagons, they say, never broke down. LaForce went down in history for the way he got Tom Horn. He got the gunman drunk and made him confess to a murder with a stenographer hidden away taking it all down. That confession, pulled from a conversation, sent Horn to the gallows in 1903. A Mormon bodyguard and gunman, Rockwell is said to have killed more men than Earp and Holiday combined. A prophecy said no bullet would harm him if he never cut his hair. He cut it only once, to make a wig for a sick widow. Orozco helped bring down the dictatorship in Mexico and then turned against his own allies. He switched sides with the winds of the revolution. He died in 1915, shot on American soil, fleeing from those who had once been his own people. The tomahawk in the Cheyenne warrior's hand was a weapon and a symbol of status at the same time. Around 1880, peoples like his were already hemmed in and nearly without room to fight. The portrait freezes a way of war that was being wiped out. The isolated ranch in 1870s California was a closed world. Everything that was eaten, worn, and used came from there or from a long trip into town. The cowboy in that corner went months without seeing an outsider. In 1874, when this photo was taken, the Cheyenne people were already living the pressure of the reservation and the end of the bison hunt. The portrait of the chief and his wife holds the dignity of those who were losing their own world, piece by piece. Keeping the railroad running required enormous workshops and armies of employees repairing cars and machines. Sacramento became a hub of this work. The romance of the train hit a heavy industry of oil, fire, and metal. The burro was the prospector's partner. It carried tools, food, and water along trails no horse would face. Without it, there was no expedition. Many a prospector died in the desert, but the burro, stubborn, usually found its way back. Powell lost an arm in the Civil War, and still led the first descent through the unknown Grand Canyon in wooden boats. He mapped rivers no one had mapped. A one-armed man took on rapids that frightened people with two arms. The Grand Council of 1875 brought together several nations to discuss the future in the face of the white advance. Shortly after came the war in Little Bighorn. The photo of the camp shows a unity that the government would soon set about breaking. A railroad town in Kansas always had a hotel beside the track to take in travelers and traveling salesmen. The Central was that resting spot. When the train changed routes, hotels like this emptied out and the whole town withered along with it. The great ranches of the California coast were almost fiefdoms, with dozens of workers and thousands of head of cattle. The owner ruled like a lord of the land. The cowboy did the work and saw little of the fortune he helped create. The frontier newspaper was printed by hand, on a heavy press that traveled by wagon into town. It was the voice of the place, gossip, advertisement, and politics. Where a press like that arrived, the town gained a written memory. In 1874, the Comanche were waging the Red River War, the last great resistance of the southern plains. The army responded by killing the horses and burning the camps. Without mounts or shelter, surrender became a matter of time. The stagecoach linked the wine, the hot springs, and the farms of Calistoga to the rest of California. It was the transport of those without a track nearby. Slow and dusty, it was still what kept the region connected to the world. Pacific Grove began as a religious camp of tents by the sea before becoming a town. Families spent the summer under canvas, between prayers and sea air. From the city of tents grew one of the most charming villages on the coast. In the hunt for Geronimo, General Crook did something unusual. He used Apache scouts to track other Apaches. Those born in it knew the terrain better than anyone. It was an Indian who ended up leading the army to the last free warrior. That quicksilver mine pulled mercury out of the earth, a metal used to separate the gold. The poison ran off into the water and into the bodies of those who worked there. The metal that helped enrich others quietly poisoned the miners themselves. Transporting valuables across the west was an invitation to ambush, so the cargo traveled with an escort armed to the teeth. Every man on horseback was a guard. One slip at a bend was enough to turn an entire convoy into a robbery headline. The isolated log cabin in the mountains of Colorado was the home of the solitary miner. A single room, fire in the corner, snow outside. Spending the winter there, alone, tested the limit of anyone chasing the gold vein. This is the Montana of Charlie Russell, the artist who would paint that world. The cook tent was the crew's gathering point after a day with the cattle. There they ate, told stories, and got the gear ready for one more hard day. California became an orange powerhouse, and the fruit left the farm by wagon to supply the cities. What was once desert and cattle became orchard. The state's gold, in the end, turned out to be the citrus on the trees as well. In the assimilation schools, indigenous children were torn from their families to learn the white way of life. They cut their hair, changed their clothes, and forbade their languages. The classroom looked ordinary, but it was part of a larger project, to erase one culture and force another into shape. In Alaska, the prospector faced deadly cold for a slim chance of finding gold. Most returned to camp empty-handed, exhausted and frozen. For everyone who struck it rich, many only took home hunger and fingers lost to the ice. Estes Park, high in the Rocky Mountains, drew hunters and adventurers long before it became a tourist destination. Camping there meant being alone with the mountain. From the camp of a few, there later grew one of the most visited parks in the country. Lead was born right beside the Homestake, one of the largest gold mines in history, which operated for more than 100 years. The town existed to feed the mine, and the mine to empty the mountain. As long as there was gold, lead lived. The American cowboy copied nearly everything from the Mexican vaquero: the saddle, the lasso, the spurs, and even the words. Men like these, in Tucson, were the true masters of the trade. The legend turned blonde in the movies, but it began dark-haired, speaking Spanish. Diamond City sprang up from a gold rush and vanished when the vein dried up. The miners crowded into cabins with their own horses to get through the winter. Today, of the town that once held thousands of people, barely a stone is left standing on another. The California grizzly bear was a symbol of the state and was hunted until it vanished, extinct by around the 1920s. It remains on the flag, but only there. They killed the real animal and kept the drawing, like a trophy of a nature they destroyed. Striking the camp and moving on was the life of the Plains nations, always following the bison. But now the march was no longer free. It was toward the reservation. The same scene as always, this time, meant the end of a way of living. In the Modoc War, about 50 warriors led by Captain Jack held off the army for months, hidden in a lava field. To beat them, the army recruited scouts from other tribes. Indian ended up hunting Indian in the desert. The real cowboy earned a starvation wage and lived months in the saddle, far from everything. The solemn photo with hat and revolver is just a pose from a rare day in town. The rest of the time it was dust, cattle, and solitude. In 1882, the country passed a law to bar Chinese immigration, the first to ban an entire people by origin. The Chinese who were already here, like those in this camp, raised railroads in cities and still became the target of official hatred. Before the automobile, the one who kept the West moving was the blacksmith. He shot horses, repaired wagons, and forged tools. His shop was garage, station, and ironworks all at once. Without that anvil, the town came to a halt. Hunting in the California ranges was sport and necessity at the same time. The meat rounded out the pantry and the hide turned into money. But the unchecked hunting that seemed harmless, there was already sweeping entire species off the map. The Chinese did the most dangerous work on the railroad, lowered in baskets down cliffs to plant explosives in the rock. They died by the hundreds. When the historic track was completed, almost none of them appeared in the official celebration photo. The small homestead in 1870s California was the result of muscle and stubbornness. With no machinery, everything was done by hoe and sweat. The photo of the three posing holds the pride of those who wrenched a life out of a piece of raw land. The roundup gathered the cattle scattered across the open range to brand and sort. Around 1890, with barbed wire fencing everything in, that scene began to disappear. Striking that camp was also striking down an entire era. Indigenous delegations were brought to Washington to negotiate, and on top of that, to be impressed by the power of the government. They posed in full dress at a studio in the Capitol. They came to deal with treaties that almost always would head back home already broken. The gold rush wasn't only for men. Women faced the same icy mountain, hauling loads and braving the cold toward the Klondike. Some went to prospect, others went to make a living, serving the thousands of miners hungry for everything. In 1877, the Nez Perce people fled more than 900 miles trying to escape the army, until Chief Joseph surrendered with the words that he would fight no more forever. 20 years later, this couple still carried the weight of that defeat. The trading post near the fort was where soldier, settler, and indigenous person traded goods and news. It sold everything from tobacco to ammunition. In the middle of the Arizona desert, the counter was the only meeting point for miles around. Even at the end of the world, the 4th of July was a pretext for a parade, a band, and a patriotic speech. The whole town stopped to celebrate. It was the day the dusty settlement dressed itself up as a country, even if only for a few hours. Nome exploded when gold was discovered in the very sand of the beach. In months, a town of board and mud sprang up at the tip of Alaska. Anyone with a shovel could try their luck on the shore, and thousands went to do exactly that.